God's holy word, God's eternal word, reminds us, remember the days of old. That message specifically was given to the Israelites after they left the land of bondage in Egypt. But even us, here in the 21st century, it's good for us to stop from time to time because the Lord wants us to reminisce, look back over our lives, look back over the history as we know, and think about how the Lord has been faithful, who has been majestic and wonderful, dealing in our lives individually and corporately as a church. And that's why we're here today. The Archives Committee of Barfield Baptist Church recording this program for the legacy of the church, which encompasses over 100 years. And as we look forward, in fact, somebody much wiser than me many years ago said the history or the past is a vanguard to the future. You can't truly appreciate the future unless you have an understanding of the past or the history. With me today, Rachel Morton, Bobby Douglas, and on my right, Joyce Helton. Rachel, let's start with you. Give us some early recollections that you have concerning Barfield Baptist Church.
I was brought here as a baby. My dad was a deacon here, and it's the only church I've ever been to except just a visitation with a friend or a family member to their church for a one-day service. I became a member here in 1945 when I was 12 years old. The first pastor that I can distinctively remember was Brother Greenville. He had no legs. Men would help him up, pick his wheelchair up and set it up in the church, and then they would set it up to the pulpit. And he was a good preacher. He was soft-spoken, but he taught the Bible. And he also preached my dad's funeral. My dad passed away in 1941. We lived 2 miles from the church, and we walked every Sunday to church, and we didn't come at night because, I don't know, they might not have had church at night. And I can remember several of the pastors, but the one next that I remember the most was Leonard Arbuckle. He was a pastor here when I was saved and when I was a teenager, and he lived right down here in the little rock house on the corner. Had a beautiful wife and 3 little girls, but after they left here, they had a little boy also. But he didn't baptize me because he had to go preach a revival somewhere, and the man that preached our revival was a Brother Wells. And I don't remember the next pastor because I was busy raising my family, and we came to church on Sunday morning, but we milked cows and we didn't get to come at night. And I've been here ever since.
Joyce, your introduction to Barfield Baptist Church was a little bit different from Rachel's. Tell us about it.
My family moved to Barfield Community in 1950. I was a freshman in high school, and we lived here only a few months. We lived right down the street in Mr. Grady Summers' house, who was a deacon here. And, of course, I met my husband Billy here, and he was born and raised into this church. His grandfather, who was a brother to Rachel's father, I believe, he was a deacon also. And so I met Billy here, and we got married in 1953, and I've been here ever since. And everybody tells me that I'm older than dirt because I've been here so long, but Rachel's been here longer than I have. But that's the story. That's the story. That's how I got here. Yeah.
Bobby, you told me earlier about your introduction to Barfield. You came here as a worker. Tell that story again.
Yeah, I was, I guess, probably about 19 or 20 year old when we came here to work. my my dad, he taken the job of re-roofing the old auditorium, you know. So we all came, my brother, a couple of my brothers, you know, came over, and we tore the roof off. And while we were eating lunch, it came up a rain and got a little wet in the auditorium floor. So we didn't have anything on the floor but just boards, you know. And so the floor was just soaked, you know, when we got back. But we didn't have any problem with it because wasn't anything to get, you know, messed up.
Rachel, give us a history lesson. If I remember correctly, I've heard you say that the first assembly of worshiping here began under a shade tree. Is that correct?
Not in my lifetime.
No, I don't mean in your lifetime, but 120 years ago.
Well, I've been told that story. But when I first remember the church, it was just the one little room, and it had no air condition or nothing, and there was a heater somewhere, but I can't remember where that heater was or what it looked like. But it was, we just had the coal oil lights, and it was raised the windows. And when you had, they called it protracting meeting, and it was always in August. And it was right when it was the hottest, and they'd raise the windows, and the church would be full, and everybody was fanning, and there was people gathered around the windows to hear, and you couldn't get a breath of air if there was one out there. But everybody just came from everywhere. Just, you know, they really wanted to come and hear the gospel preached. And then when I was a teenager, I remember two meetings. We had a big tent outside, but it was a lot different. It was just a very small church with, I guess, 4 windows on each side, or maybe 2 windows on each side. But then, Bobby, wasn't it in the 50s that they built the new Sunday school rooms?
Yeah, we worked on the Sunday school rooms. I didn't work on the main rooms, you know, but we had a group come in and do that, you know.
Well, my husband wired those new Sunday school rooms, and I believe it was in the 50s.
It was between 50 and 53 they were built, because when we were living here in 50, they had not been built. But in 53, when we got married, they had been built. So it was sometime in that time frame.
Joyce, from the history that you recall that was passed down, tell us some interesting stories about how the church has grown for over 100 years.
Oh, my mother-in-law used to tell me quite a few stories about the church and about her dad and Rachel's dad going out on Saturday afternoon on horseback, going around the community, which there weren't many houses in here then. And they would ride on horseback on Saturday afternoon trying to get enough money to pay the preacher on Sunday morning.
I wonder what he was paid. Any idea?
Well, I have seen some old records. I would come down here and clean out closets, and I found a lot of records in there. And the morning offering one Sunday was 39 cents.
39 cents?
39 cents. Yeah.
Wow. Rachel, I've heard stories about doctors who used to ride a horse and go maybe for $1 a visit. So this is kind of reminiscent of that era in time when if a pastor got 39 cents, I guess he thought he was doing well.
I don't know, but doctors used to come to the house. I was born in the old farmhouse, and the doctor had to come from Christiana. And then my brother was born after me, and I remember my daddy had to go get the doctor and bring him to the house to attend to my mother during my brother's birth, and then he had to take him back home. But I think I heard the story they paid him $2. but that's just hearsay.
I have heard stories that in this era of time we're talking about, how schools would let out if a revival service was going on at a certain church, schools would let out for the children to attend the revival because they had revival in the daytime as well as in the evening. Do you recall those stories?
Well, we had it in August every year, and school was already out.
So I guess had school been in progress,
They probably would.
yeah. How about you, Joyce? Do you recall any stories like that?
No, I was raised in town, so the kids didn't get out of school to work in the fields, so we didn't have that in the city.
You were a city
I
girl.
was a city girl, yeah. And my father-in-law told Billy, my husband, said, "Don't you bring that girl out here, she won't stay."
I thought it wouldn't last.
They thought that, yeah, 66 years ago.
Rachel, as a little girl growing up in this community, and as you said earlier, this is really the only church you've ever seriously attended. What were the revival services like when you were a young girl growing up?
Well, they were not much different from church now, but there was more women at the morning service than there was men. And we had a few that would get happy and go to shouting and carrying on. But it was just about the same thing. But when they did pass the offering plate, you would hear change being dropped in instead of dollars, because people then didn't have many dollars. But Mr. Ralph, I know one story that nobody else don't know.
Okay.
We walked to school one morning, and I really don't know the year, but there was Army vehicles parked in the church yard, and it was still just the same little one-room building. And I loved the soldiers. I felt so sorry for them, and I was in less than the 8th grade because that's as far as our school across the street here went. And I just didn't want to go into school that morning. I wanted to come over here and say something to them, or I wanted to stand out and watch them. But I was just so glad that they took shelter. It rained and was cold, and they took shelter in our church building. But when you went in the church, you would have never known that anybody had been in there. But that just warmed my heart to know that the boys that were going across the ocean to fight for us had slept in our church.
Yeah. For those who may have never heard, these were called the maneuvers. This was prior to and during World War II, and I'm told that the terrain here in Middle Tennessee is much similar to Germany and France, so they trained here in preparation for going overseas. So they had a training exercise, or what they call maneuvers, and that's what you're talking about. Yeah.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Because 2 groups of the maneuvers camped on our farm. One group was way back in the woods, and we didn't see very much of them, but they had an airplane tied in with them, and they took one of our hay fields and ruined the hay, making a place for the landing, and they paid my mother what they thought was honest because they had ruined the hay. But then the others was on toward the end of the war, like the boys that slept in our church, and they were up closer to the house, and we got to know them better.
Bobby, in your opinion, how has Barfield Baptist Church served as a focal point, or kind of a centerpiece for the Barfield community? In your opinion, what has this church in this location served the community?
Barfield has been pretty good light for this community. Of course, I didn't live in the community, but the ones that came here, they had special feelings about it.
Yeah, yeah. Joyce, from what you have been told, trace for us, and I'm sure Rachel may want to join in too, how the church has gone through the years, additions have been made. And I know one story you shared with me is the membership got down pretty low at one time, about 30 members. And let's reminisce about those days.
We had gotten down so low that, and the morale in the church was just terrible. We had some problems in the church that nobody wanted to face, I guess is what it boiled down to. But we were down to 30-something when we called Brother Ron, and we didn't have any money. The church our money was gone. And when we interviewed him, we went to hear him preach at Barfield Baptist Church one morning, and Brother Murray Mathis was instrumental in him being here because he was pastor at Walter Hill, and he knew Ron was wanting to preach, and he sent the search committee a letter and said, I have this young man who is wanting to pastor a church, and I want y'all to interview him or to hear him. So he said, I'm going to be out of the pulpit. Brother Ron will be in the pulpit at Walter Hill on this certain Sunday. So we went over and we heard him preach. And on the way home, it was 5 of us on the committee. We all rode together. So we decided we want to talk to him. And he agreed to come and to talk to us and preach a trial sermon. And, he had 4 little kids. And I think all 4 of them cried that morning. Something happened. I think one of them bumped their head and one went to sleep. And during the invitation, went down the aisle and said, I want my daddy. And they thought, well, this is it, that we'll never be called now. But anyway, and we just interviewed him and told him we didn't have any money. If he could work for what we could afford to pay him, and he agreed. And we told him, when we grow, will you go full time? And he said that was his desire. So that was the best move we made. I tell you, Brother Ron has really been a blessing to this church and to this community. And the growth has just been phenomenal. It's just grown and grown and grown. So, and now we've got the property paid for, and we're going to be ready to build a church. So, yeah.
If I remember correctly, I think that church leaders with Concord Baptist Association even encouraged Barfield to close the doors.
Yes, we had interviewed a pastor. We had a call for him, and the church turned him down. So I went to his office, the director of missions office, and I told him I needed a resume, and he said, well, he handed me one, or he slid it across the desk. He said, well, I don't recommend him. He said, y'all just need to close the door of that church. You're never going to do anything else. And I told him, I said, no. God opened the church, and God will close it. Right. He's not through with us yet. So that's when we called Brother Ron.
Rachel, I'm sure that you have some interesting stories, maybe some funny stories about how the church has gone through the years. Want to share with us?
Well, I don't know about how funny, but I always had early elementary. I don't know what our class was called. And at that time, they were all boys, and some of them were mine. Couldn't nobody handle them. And I don't know if it was the deacon or the preacher, he'd always come and get me. And I said, I don't want to teach them. I said, I've got 2 sons in there. And they would try to find a teacher, and they couldn't find a teacher. Then one family had a little girl, and she was smaller than those boys, but she always wanted to be with me. And I didn't have a little girl of my own at that time. And so I took her in there with me, and I would get on to the boys. I am bad about children behaving. I got in trouble once at my job for trying to make the kids behave. But anyway, I stayed in that class so long that I didn't think I was learning anything. but maybe I was teaching them something. But I would tell them, look how nice the little girl is, and you boys are so rowdy, and that's how I calmed them down, teasing them about the girls would be so much better than little boys. But back to the days of my Sunday school class, I had some wonderful Sunday school teachers.
Give us some names.
I will. Ms. Alec Briley was my first Sunday school teacher. Now, the Brileys and the Summers, they were the leaders of this church for a long time. They didn't hardly get along, but they had some disputes, but they were the leaders. One Sunday, the Brileys would get their way, and one Sunday, the Summers would get their way, but they always managed to work it out. But they were the kind of the backbone of the church there for all of my young years. And the Methodists, we have a Methodist church right down the street, and they had church every other Sunday. And the Sundays that they didn't have church, they would come down here. And the Summers had an aunt that wasn't married and lived by herself, and I'm sure everybody knows all the tales of the old Spencer women. And she'd come in with a flower sticking in her hair or in her clothes or something somewhere. I know those old spider lilies, she wore them till all of us kids made fun of her. But we enjoyed having the Methodists here with us. And then another Sunday school teacher of mine was Elizabeth Smotherman. And she had no children. And her sister had a little girl. And then she was trying to have a son. And she died in childbirth as well as the son dying. And they gave Miss Elizabeth that girl. And she was raising her. And then Paul, the little girl's daddy, got married again, and he took the little girl away from Elizabeth. And then God gave Elizabeth a little girl of her own. She gave birth to a baby girl. And God's been working here in this church in many, many ways. And we used to have the baptizing down here in the river. I was baptized down here in the river. It was on the left-hand side of the bridge if you was going toward the highway. And then we finally had a baptistry. And all 4 of my children were saved here. Most all of my grandchildren were. My one son has not lived here for his kids to go to church here. And the youngest son's children were at Christiana. But I've seen most of my grandchildren baptized here and my great-grandchildren. And this church is just home to me. Of course, I've already said my dad's funeral was here. My mother's funeral was here in 1955. And help me, Joyce, what was the preacher's name? Bailey?
I think that's correct.
Brother Bailey?
I think that's right.
And he would come to the house to see Mama. Mama had the old dreaded disease, Lou Gehrig's disease, but Lou Gehrig hadn't had it, so it wasn't called that then, but it's a terrible old thing. And the preachers were just here if you needed them. They came to the house. We had no vehicle. They would take you somewhere, if you needed to go, and there's just a lot of friendship here. But now, and I'm not complaining, there's so many people here, I don't know who was here this Sunday.
Let me ask you this. How did you begin teaching a Sunday school class?
Because the kids were so mean, nobody else couldn't handle them.
How many years have you been doing it?
Oh, I don't know. I've just tried to fill in anywhere that I was needed. I had those kids until they got grown, I guess. And then in the class I'm in now, and I don't claim to be a teacher. I might be a leader, but I don't really claim to know as much about the Bible as you do, of course, or a lot of other people, because I was off trying to make a living and raise my family and my family's family, and didn't do as much studying as I should have. But we had a Sunday school teacher in there, and she got sick, and she wasn't here every Sunday, and they would just call on me to take over, and that's just how it's been the last, not 10 years, because she hadn't been gone 10 years, I don't guess.
Bobby, I know your expertise is construction. You're a great handyman, a great construction man. And through the years, you have done a lot of repair work. You've done a lot of fix-up projects here at Barfield. Talk about that.
Yeah, we started out in the 70s. We tore the roof off of the old auditorium and started all over with the roof. It was, I don't know, it was probably 15 or 20 of us, I guess, volunteers that took, participated in the building of it.
Uh-huh.
And so we had a pretty good crew on everything.
Yeah.
So your first roof didn't work long.
Well, first 10 years, I don't know too much about it, but it was a lot of stuff went on.
Yeah. Bobby, you have served as a deacon. You've served as a leader in this church. In your own words, what does Barfield Baptist Church mean to you personally?
Well, Barfield is a place where we can come to, and I can come to, and meet the Lord. We had at times had people come in, and do different things, and we had, it was just a place to meet the Lord. So it was.
How about you, Rachel? What does it mean to you to walk in the doors? Of course, we know the Lord is not confined to a church building. He's everywhere, everywhere he wants to be. But when you enter this building, what kind of spiritual satisfaction do you get?
Well, it's very similar to when you see the American flag raised, or when you see a group of people performing for the Lord and doing what you'd think is great spiritual stuff, or a group singing, your heart just swells up inside you. And I know when they were talking about building this part of the church that we're sitting in now, a fellow church member came out to me as I was getting in my car and said, "How are you going to feel when they build this new church they're talking about?" I said, "Well, I guess the same way that I felt when they were going to build this." I said, I was proud and hoping that there would be enough people attend for us to pay for it. But still, the little corners down in the first old church still means a whole lot to me. Like I can remember I was way back in the corner of the first Sunday school room that was built when the Lord was dealing with me. And I was saying, well, I can't get out. I can't go up tonight. I can't get out. But when the first words were said, I got out of that corner. But it's just a feeling in your heart that it's going to be sad to me to leave here, and I may not be living when the new church gets built. But I plan for my funeral to be in Barfield Baptist Church, whether it's here or down the street.
Bobby, I was thinking about, I guess we could call it a testimony, what Rachel was sharing about how she really got serious about the Lord. Do you mind sharing when Jesus really, really, really became real to you?
Yeah, Brother LeMay was a preacher here, and we had worked around, him out on the field, and so he got on to me about becoming a Christian. So I got sort of roused up about it about that time, and he was the one that really won me to Christ,
Yeah.
Brother LeMay.
Well, we never know. Well, the Lord tells us in Scripture, His word will never return void. And even like today, anything that we do to truly represent the Lord will produce a harvest. We may not see it, but somebody will benefit from it.
Yeah, he works in mysterious ways, he says.
Yeah. Joyce, I was thinking about Billy, your husband, a deacon here. You and Billy worked untiringly for many years behind the scenes. I would dare say that not many people knew all of the things that you and Billy did here. But Jesus said, as you've done for the least, you've done for me. So you were working for the Lord.
Yeah, that's right. And we were doing it for him and for his glory. And, I didn't mind coming down here. I'd come down here some weeks, a couple of days a week, and clean and do whatever. And he was, very rarely did we start out anywhere to it. He would say, we need to go by the church. Why? We need to go check on things. And he would put in light bulbs, he'd change air filters, he would, whatever needed to be done. And sometimes we had to go 3 or 4 places to get the filters for the air conditioner or the light bulbs out there on the porch. We had to go to a certain place to get a certain bulb. They were not cheap either. But anyway, and he did that, and he didn't want any glory for it, and neither did I. We did it strictly for the Lord.
You don't do it for the applause.
Right.
You do it to honor the Lord.
That's right. That's right.
I ask Bobby and I ask Rachel, let me ask you, when you walk in the doors of this church on Sunday morning or a Wednesday or a Sunday night, what does the Lord say to you in your soul, in your spirit?
This is a safe place. No matter what we've got on our minds. I'm sorry. What's in our hearts, we can leave it at the door and come in and rest. It's peaceful.
Worship the Lord in spirit and in truth.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Rachel, let me get back to you. Of course, none of us know the future. We know who holds tomorrow, but we don't know what is going to happen tomorrow, but we know who holds our hand. What would be your prayer as this church moves forward to a new building, expanding the service in the community? What would be your prayer for Barfield Baptist Church?
For the church to grow and yet be together, for everybody to have their needs met here. I don't believe in building such a, to me, I don't believe that it's really necessary to build an elaborate building, something that is just nice to see or different. It's the people that make the church. It's not the building. But they need a good building to worship in. But when I've gone on food service conventions, I've always included a trip to a church in every city I've been to. And some of them are the most elaborate things, and it's a cold feeling there. I don't ever want Barfield Baptist Church to have a cold feeling. I want it to be warm, where if there's a need for somebody to be helped, that need to be met, but not for just people to just come with their hand out to get a handout. If there's a need, I would like for that need to be met, and for Barfield Baptist Church to always be here until the Lord comes for everybody.
Bobby, what is your prayer for Barfield Baptist Church?
My prayer is that Barfield can afford a church that they're going to build. Now, we have people that give a lot to this church, and it means a lot to it. But we got to have some way to realize that these people that give a lot, it's going to be used the right thing. Now, as far as elaborate building, I don't see it. We need real elaborate building, but that's what they're going to build. They're going to build a building that's going to look good, and it's going to be a nice place to go to worship the Lord. It's just a place that we all can come together and worship the Lord.
Well said. Joyce, your prayer for Barfield Baptist Church?
Just to continue growing and to see more people saved. That's why we're here. And that's my prayer and my wish. And just like they said, to be here until Jesus comes back.
And we look forward to that day, don't we?
We do. We do.
A special thank you to our special guest, Rachel Morton, Bobby Douglas, and Joyce Helton. I call her Joycey, and I say that with respect and with love. We thank you for the time letting us share some memories of Barfield Baptist Church. Anybody with a closing thought? Rachel, anything you'd like to add? Anything comes to mind?
Well, it's just a big difference in what my first memory is and where we're sitting today. I just really hadn't thought about it, the change that is in the buildings of the church, but the feeling is still the same.
Yeah. Bobby, any final word from you?
No, nothing.
Okay. And Joyce?
Well, that we'll continue to grow and that we'll keep our sweet, sweet spirit that we have here in this church. And you know that. Yeah.
There's a sweet, sweet spirit, and we know it's the Spirit of the Lord. Thank you.